Good day to you. I'm standing here in my dining room, and one of the paintings that we have up is a painting that one of my former colleagues from the art department painted for me. And if I were to tell you that she is originally from Japan, you probably wouldn't be surprised by that because of the style of the art. In the same room over here, I have a board that my wife and I put together of drawings that were given to us by a Chinese student. And the drawings are of animals. And look how intricate they are. Now, when she gave us those, we actually met her in China when I was teaching a class there. I'm going to walk to the university now for today's lecture. When she gave us those, it was because she came to America after we had already seen her in China the year before. And I wanted to thank her for those, but I also wanted to talk to her about them, but I felt it was hard to get a handle on the words. It was hard to ask her what those symbols meant without really knowing about mythology of symbols in Chinese culture, mythology of turtles and unicorns and other things that she had written, which I'm sure are playing a role in bringing up Chinese citizens. It's passing on cultural traditions through symbolic representations of mystical figures and other kinds of things that are represented in paintings like that to teach about the culture. So this is the way that I'm opening up class today. I'm describing to you barriers that get in the way of understanding each other when we come from different cultures. And that's what we're going to talk about today in Chapter 3. We're talking about barriers to intercultural communication. And the chapter is unusual compared to the other chapters in that theoretically it's not that long. It lays out a few concepts, which I'm going to cover. And then on the back end of the chapter, actually most of the pages are devoted to really interesting case studies, which I'm going to ask you to read on your own, which you'll need to read anyhow, potentially for the quiz today. And those case studies really trot out really good examples of those concepts. But still, let's take them on anyhow. They come from a researcher, by the way. The researcher is LaRae Barnes. LaRae Barnes in the 1970s, came out with these 6 barriers, with the idea being that if we can overcome these barriers or prevent them from being erected in the first place, then we can understand each other a lot better when we're coming from different cultures. And again, when we're using that word culture, we're not just talking about foreign cultures. We're also talking about cultures within our own country. So let's take on those barriers. The first one is anxiety. Anxiety is something that everybody experiences when they go to a foreign country or even mixes in with a different culture. You know, I can tell you when I drive to Philadelphia, if I get on Route 611 and I start going through Northeast Philly, I have some anxiety. I have some anxiety. What if I break down? Am I gonna be faced with a situation that might be a little dicey, crime-wise? You know, totally unfair of me, probably, although maybe statistics on crime would back up that I would have a right to be a little bit more worried, but I feel anxiety. And that causes me not to get out of the car and pull over at a convenience store or a gas station if I want to get some water because I've got the anxiety. And it's like that when you go to a foreign culture. You know, when food is served to you and you're not quite sure how to eat. You know, when you go to France, for example, you sit down and you wait forever for the waiter. And the waiter finally comes, or the waitress, and you're thinking to yourself as an American, this service sucks. It's really slow. Well, guess what? That's the way that the French eat. They want you to sit down. They want you to relax. They want you to enjoy yourself for a meal. And that doesn't mean shoving the food down and clearing out the table so the next potential tippers can come into the table and tip the waitress and keep things moving. It's not like that in France. You have several courses of meals. You have 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you sit down to have a French meal, it can be intimidating. We eat faster. We're used to having our salad with our entree. You know, customs that are foreign give us anxiety. So how do you overcome the anxiety? Well, I'm not sure that you can, but I think that one thing you can do is recognize it when you have it, and as you start to assimilate into the culture with an open-mindedness, hopefully the anxiety will subside. Now we go into the second barrier. The second barrier is known as assuming similarities on the part of cultures rather than differences. So you sit next to a person, and Donald Trump comes on the television, and you make a comment. And you make a comment to that person, and your comment is saying something like, I can't stand him. Or, alternatively, you're saying, he's the greatest thing that's happened. You're making an opinion, in other words. What you're doing in that situation is you're, in essence, saying, you know, I'm going to talk about this subject in a way that assumes that you also think as I do. And if you don't, that's fine, but I'm going to start with the assumption that you do. And that's what this premise is all about for this barrier. It's the idea that when we see foreign cultures, when we see cultures that are different from our own, we assume that there are more similarities. And the book has some great descriptions of how that takes place in these case studies. So check out that concept in more detail in the book. Now we come to the third barrier, which is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is where, it's kind of like having a friend, and all they ever do is talk about themselves. They are telling you, I. If you say to them something like, I was late for class today, I almost didn't make it to take the exam, their response is not going to be something like, oh, that must have been terrible. You must have been stressed out. How did you do on the exam? Those kind of questions don't come out from a person who's ethnocentric or who is egocentric. Instead, they say, oh, the same thing happened to me. I can't believe it. I had to... And they start telling you their story, thinking probably that they're relating to you. That's egocentric behavior, and it also occurs on a world scale as ethnocentric behavior. It's when you focus all of the attention, all of the needs, all of the understanding on your own country. You're kind of preoccupied with your own country. We can actually see this in the way that a lot of Americans describe the United States. They describe it as the greatest country in the world. I mean, how would you feel if you're Spain and you hear that? What makes the U.S. a greater country than Spain? I don't know. Is it because we're freer? Is it because we have military might? Is it because we're an economic powerhouse? Is it because we assist other countries around the world? Well, those are all really great qualities. And it does make the country, the U.S., a great country. But the greatest? It's like saying, who's the greatest son in your family? Who's the greatest daughter in your family? And it's ethnocentrism. It's believing that your culture is better than others. And we have that, unfortunately, throughout the history of many civil wars. There was an awful civil war in Rwanda and in Africa between the Hutus and the Tutsis. These were two tribes. And it was triggered by radio ads, among other things it was triggered by, but it was triggered by radio ads, if I remember this right, on the part of the Tutsis, and they were calling the Hutus cockroaches on the radio because they believed that that ethnicity was inferior to the Tutsis. And so it started a civil war. I mean, who wants to think that you're inferior just by virtue of being born into a particular culture? That's ethnocentrism at its core, and obviously it's a big barrier to intercultural understanding. Now we move next to a word that you've discussed in many other contexts, and that's the word stereotypes. Interestingly, though, stereotypes don't necessarily have to be negative. They just have to be categorizing somebody without really finding out whether that person fits into that category. It's sort of a first glance way of understanding somebody. So positive stereotypes, for example, we tend to think of Asians, rightly or wrongly, as being really good at math, for example. There's a stereotype right there. We tend to think of African Americans as, not we, but some people speak about African Americans as being able to dance better than so-called white people. These are stereotypes. I'm not saying that I believe these. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm talking about the way that people are described. And of course, people are described negatively. Jews, for example, are described sometimes negatively when money is talked about with them. My own ethnicity, Scottish people, has a similar situation when it comes to money. We share with Jewish people, and that is we are known as frugal. Although frugal has a slightly more positive ring to it than somebody who is who's cheap, which is the other stereotype. And so stereotypes get in the way. We see people and we think, okay, yeah, that person is from this culture. I know how they're going to act. They're going to do all this crazy stuff, not the way that we act. Of course, they may be looking at us saying what we're doing is the crazy stuff, and that's not the way that they act. And that's what we need to keep in mind, in my opinion, when thinking about stereotypes. So stereotypes do differ from the next barrier, which is known as prejudice. Prejudice is kind of, it's a kind of a word that's gone out of currency, really. It was very widely used in the 60s and 70s to discuss racial tensions in this country. And prejudice is where you believe that by virtue of being born into a particular race, you are automatically superior or better than another race. And this is a worldwide problem. Almost every country in the history of it has enslaved another peoples because they believe that those peoples were inferior based on race. We can look at the Greeks, for example. The Greeks enslaved what they called as barbarians, people who lived outside of Greece, and they made them build Greek buildings. In Germany, I wouldn't say enslaved, but Germany brought in Turkish people from Turkey, to do manual labor jobs because Germans seem to be better. I'm not saying all Germans. I'm saying there's a line of thinking saying Germans think that as well. And here in the United States, right now, we have millions of Mexicans picking vegetables and fruit in the western states. And that's because there is a thinking that, well, it's not a job that I want to do. I have better aspirations for myself because I'm white. You know, that's a level of thinking that exists out there, and obviously it's a barrier to intercultural communication. And then we come to the most blatant form of all of this kind of inferiority, superiority, placing value over one particular race and another, and it is racism. It's racism, and racism takes it further. It's not only thinking that another race is inferior, it's actually enacting that inferiority by oppressing that race, as we did in this country for so many years with African Americans, and making them sit on the back of the bus and drink out of their own particular water fountains. It's racism at its core, and we can even say that racism began much earlier in this country with Native Americans, perceiving the warrior, oddly enough, our mascot here at ESU, as a savage, right? Somebody who's not civilized, somebody who will drink your blood, somebody who will take your scalp. Yeah, the inferiority of the Indians, which they're not even Indians, right? They're Native Americans. And by today's standards, oddly enough, we're revisiting a lot of Indian ideas like earth, wind, fire. I can't remember the other one. And those 4 components of the earth and how we need to take care of the earth. Otherwise, it might not be around for us. Those are Native American ideas, but they got lost in the racist purges in this country when we chased them onto reservations in the most inhospitable parts of our country to live in. All right, and then finally we go to the back part of the book now, and it gets into case studies. It's got 3 really interesting case studies. One is the Roma peoples. I don't know if you've heard of those. Not to be confused with Romans. Not to be confused with Romanians, although a lot of Roma people do live in Romania. Romas are known as gypsies. You may know them as gypsies if you've been to Europe. I can tell you, they have a lot of negative stereotypes and prejudices and racism against them. Mainly because they're perceived to be largely stealers, people who steal. So, you know, it is fairly common if you're in Paris. You got to have your wits about you. If you're hanging around the Eiffel Tower, you're looking up, oh, what a beautiful Eiffel Tower. Meanwhile, somebody who is a Roma, a child even, may walk up to you with a newspaper that they're reading out like this, you know. And under that newspaper is their hand. And while they're pretending to read a newspaper, they're also putting their hand in your pocket and taking your wallet or your purse or your cell phone. And that's what a stereotype is for a lot of Roma peoples. But their background is very interesting. They don't have a country, per se. They're nomadic peoples, and they're all over Europe. Just last summer, I was in Sweden, and there were Roma people that commute to Sweden to beg. Think about that. They go to Sweden because the donations, the charity is going to be much more generous than if they're begging in Romania. So they actually commute, and they have an organized system of begging. They all have their own stations, and when they're done, they report back, turn the money over to their supervisor, and they go sleep in some kind of shelter and then come out and do it the next day. They do that all summer long, then they go back to Romania or wherever they're living. So you got the Romas that you can check out. And then the second case study is Japan and Korea. And that might be interesting to you given what's going on today with Korea, the 2 Koreas potentially coming together, South Korea and North Korea. It's been a divided peninsula since the 1950s. But actually Korea has a history with Japan. Yeah, Japan annexed Korea, took it over as a country, made it part of Japan, and then Koreans started to migrate to Japan because there were better opportunities there, similar to how Puerto Ricans, some, migrate to the U.S. And then Japan reversed course and started to take those freedoms away from Korea. So there's some interesting information there about two countries that you may not have known previously had that relationship. And then finally, the chapter ends with a case study on China and the U.S. And that's hits on some similar themes that I started out class with today. China is a country that has a very interesting history from a communist standpoint, with Chiang Kai-shek, who was originally fighting for the Chinese and sympathizing with communists, and then he flipped his position and was anti-communist, and then he was chased by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong became the first communist leader of China, and Chiang Kai-shek took his whole army and went into exile on the island of Taiwan, which is right off of China. And today there's still a dispute that's going on. So this particular case study covers the relationship between the U.S. and China. And there are really some incredible similarities in terms of both countries being very, very isolated, being very insular to the outside world, not letting a lot of outside influences coming in. But then again, there are vast differences in the areas of cultural barriers, which you can read about in this chapter. So as I stand here in front of the beautiful Monroe Building here at ESU, I'm wrapping up our lecture today, and I hope you have a great day.